was about 11, I think. Um, that's when I started actually driving. My dad threw me in the passenger seat of the same Mini um, that my sister had started racing in, and he showed me how to do handbrake turns. And next thing I know, I'm in the driver's seat. I had to get a block of foam this thick underneath myself just so I could see up over the dash, and that's in a Mini too. And yeah, he taught me how to drive, and within about 10 minutes of me actually driving, changing gears, he's pulling the handbrake on. So within 15 minutes of me learning how to drive, I was doing handbrake turns. Yeah, and I did that for quite a few years, right up until about the end of high school. And I found music, and that's sort of like my other big passion is playing music. I've played in bands basically non-stop ever since, about the last 15 years or so, and that kind of pulled me out of motorsport a little bit. I wasn't really racing anymore. I wasn't doing motorcarners or carnocross or super sprint or anything like that anymore, but I still had this passion for cars. It was my sister that really took off with rallying. She's gotten really into that. She still does it now to this day. You know, she would always have her rally car in the garage being worked on. Dad had his car and project car, which is sitting just behind me. That was always around. There was always something going on in the garage. So basically, my entire life, I'd be in the garage with that tool in hand, working away on something, asking lots of annoying questions, and learning how things work. I followed the '86 basically from when a lot of the concepts first started to come out. Um, I remember seeing a lot of concept photos for it, and I think it was even in Gran Turismo or something. And I just thought, small, lightweight, affordable sports car, rear-wheel drive sports cars, especially. And there's nothing like that new anymore, and that's sort of everybody's draw to the '86, I guess. I'd grown up around classic Japanese cars, you know, all the cars that my parents raced, and everybody else in that sort of scene when I was a kid in the '90s. The cheap cars were Datsuns, Geminis, old Mitsubishi Lancers and Galants. Um, they were the affordable cars to go racing in, and so I always grew up around classic Japanese cars. My first car was a Galant, not the one behind me, one's very similar. Um, and when I first drove this, I remember thinking, it's the first modern car I've driven that's anything like an early, or what made those early Japanese cars so special. It's lightweight, it's very nimble, it's very light on its feet, it's very chuckable, it's underpowered, but surprisingly, it does a lot with so little, and that's a lot of the appeal to a lot of early Japanese cars for me, and that's the appeal of this as well. They're not refined, they're not powerful. A lot of modern cars, there's a lot of disconnect. They'll be quiet, they'll be smooth, they'll just not immediate, I guess. Um, with this, there's this real connection with driving, and because it's not that quick, you can have fun in it without doing anything really silly. It's that slow car fast mentality behind it. My dad bought that car in 1994. I've still got the receipt, and the previous owner, he bought it actually from a friend of the family who runs a wrecking yard, still does, and at the time it had been, I think the previous owner had crashed into a fence or something. There was a bit of front end damage, and my dad bought it because he wanted a project car. At the time, my dad's daily driver was a 1977 Mitsubishi Lancer, and my sister had a 1976 Galant sedan. So I think, Dad just wanted a project car, wanted something that was similar to the cars that they already had. And plus, my dad's got a very long history with these. He was rallying Lancers and Galants in the early '80s. So I think that was his connection to it, and because of that, that's my connection to early Mitsubishis. And I was a kid, he and I would work on it together. We we repaired the damage to the front of it. We straightened it out. And back then, you could quite easily get panels and parts, and it was easy to do. And so he was able to go get a couple of spare bonnets and spare guards and just bolt on straight panels. Whereas now I kind of don't have that luxury. It's 23 years later, and you cannot find them in wrecking yards at all, anywhere. I suppose my story with the car, when I became completely involved in it, it's about 10 years ago. Dad was looking to sell it, and it hadn't really progressed much further than when I was a kid. It was still sitting in the garage with straight panels but no paint, and the thing hadn't run forever. And I convinced him not to sell it, but to sell it to me instead. And so I got it back on the road, and it was on the road for a while, and the original motor, which had been sitting in the shed for 15 years, was doing okay, but it was getting a bit worn out. It was getting a bit old. One of the first things, there was an issue with the carburetor where it would drain all the fuel out of the float bolt, and these have a mechanical fuel pump in them. So if there's no fuel in the carburetor, it won't start. It won't pump fuel. It just won't start. And at the time, my girlfriend at the time was driving it, and to get it started, when it drained all the fuel out of the carburetor, we actually had to pour fuel straight into the carburetor, and the only thing we could find to store a small amount of fuel in that wouldn't melt or dissolve in the car was a glass bottle. It just happened to be a peach schnapps bottle. And I remember this one day, we were at the shops and it wouldn't start. So I just jumped straight out, popped the bonnet, and this guy come walking over. He's like, "Do you need a hand?" I was like, "No, mate, I've got this." And here's me pouring what looks like peach schnapps straight into the carburetor of this car. Hit the key, starts up, throw the air cleaner back on, got on, drove off. And that's it's one of my favourite memories of that motor in that car. I put a 4G63 twin cam motor in, a naturally aspirated version, not the turbo motor that came in the Evo, but it's pretty close to it. And everything I'd read, everything I understood was that the gearbox would bolt straight up to the engine. It's the same bell housing pattern. The engine mounts would bolt straight on because the block's the same as the rear-wheel drive version of that motor, and I was like, it'll just go straight in. Of course, it didn't. But it fought me for about 2 years, but I eventually got that motor in and running, and it was great. It's not a hugely powerful motor, but it's torquey, it's fun, it's noisy, and when you open the bonnet, it's something really, really different. 3 years ago, I think it was, maybe even longer, I was involved in an accident. I wasn't driving it. The person that wasn't at fault either. But unfortunately, it did quite a bit of damage to the front end of the car. And yeah, that took the car off the road, and it's sort of sat in waiting ever since. Just recently, I've started looking back into repairing it. And the damage isn't bad. It's not unrepairable. It's just finding the parts. Just last weekend, I drove pretty much an 800-kilometre round trip to pick up that thing. It's a rotten shell that was sitting in some guy's backyard. I bought it because it was cheap and it had straight bumper bars on it. And all that effort just to do that, and what's left of the car is basically just going to go to scrap metal. Unfortunately, it's just too far gone. But that's the length that you've got to go to get parts for these things. Primary course of action at the moment is to repair the crash damage in the front. A friend of mine who was wrecking another Galant was kind enough to actually cut the nose off one for me. The front radiator support panel is where most of the damage is, and it's such an intricately formed piece of steel, you could never really beat it out straight again. The only option really is just to cut it off and weld a new one on, and I'm lucky enough to have a perfectly straight, rust-free one sitting under my bench. Essentially, once that's straight, it's just got to go back together and get paint. I've got plans maybe to do a little bit of work with the engine, nothing crazy. I don't want to stick a turbo on it or anything. It's a 900 kilo car with leaf springs and drum brakes. It doesn't need a turbo. But something to get a little bit more induction noise out of it. Maybe maybe an individual throttle body setup just for the noise. It's not going to do much performance wise, but I don't really care about that. I just want it to sound cool. That's half the fun of driving things like this. That's really hard to nail down to one. Very, very hard to nail down to one. Things, unobtainable things like a genuine Ken Murray Skyline GTR. There's only a couple of hundred of them ever made. A Toyota 2000 GT, which this thing draws a lot of influence from as well. Interestingly enough, in its design, again, that's a unicorn car, but those things are worth, stupid money. Probably more realistic, but no less rare, would be something like an early Honda S600 or something like that. They're an incredible car. They threw so much engineering into those. Roller bearing crank in the motors, quad carbs. It had this really unusual independent rear suspension setup where it was basically two trailing arms run by chains, like motorcycle trailing arms. There's some really, really interesting stuff in that design, and they're a cool looking little car. And plus, I could probably park it sideways in front of the Galant or something in the garage here. So I think if I had to chase after another classic car, it'd probably be one of those.